The Arkansas Ozarks in the late 19th century were not a place of pastoral comfort or gentle rolling hills. They were a geographical trap of jagged limestone, dense, impenetrable hickory forests, and deep, shadowed hollows where the sunlight struggled to reach the forest floor. In the summer of 1891, the region was gripped by a suffocating, unrelenting drought that felt less like a shift in weather and more like a targeted, biblical curse. For 4 agonizing months, not a single drop of rain had fallen on Blackwood Ridge. The air itself was a physical, oppressive weight, thick with yellow dust, the constant, maddening scream of cicadas, and the smell of dying pine needles baking on the branch. The earth cracked open in deep, jagged fissures, the creeks dried into beds of cracked white clay, and the independent farmers who clung to the sides of the ridge watched helplessly as their cornstalks withered into brown, brittle husks. It was a season of profound desperation, a time when the blistering heat drove men to the very edge of madness. But at the absolute highest point of Blackwood Ridge, entirely isolated at the end of a treacherous, switchback wagon trail, the Caldwell farm presented a deeply unsettling, terrifying contradiction to the dying landscape around it. The property was ruled with an iron fist by 2 unmarried sisters who had lived in total isolation since the end of the Civil War. Cora Caldwell, the elder at 42, was a terrifying figure of a woman. She was gaunt to the point of emaciation, her skin pulled tight over sharp cheekbones, her eyes a pale, washed-out gray that held absolutely no warmth or human empathy. She was driven by a fierce, fringe religious fanaticism, quoting obscure, terrifying verses from a heavy, leather-bound family Bible to anyone foolish enough to approach her property line. She was the absolute, undisputed authority of the farm, her sharp, biting voice cracking through the dry summer air like a leather whip. Her younger sister, Ada, was a haunting, formidable counterpart. At 38, Ada was incredibly physically imposing, standing nearly 6 feet tall with the broad, heavy shoulders of a seasoned lumberjack. But Ada was completely, utterly mute. She communicated only through sharp, aggressive gestures and low, guttural grunts, handling all the brutal, back-breaking manual labor of the property with a terrifying, mechanical efficiency. The local merchants down in the Valley noted, with a collective, silent shudder, that Ada was missing the first 3 fingers of her left hand. The stumps were not the clean, surgical cuts of a farming accident involving a saw or a thresher. The scarred tissue was jagged, uneven, and violently torn, looking exactly as though they had been viciously bitten off by something with massive, crushing jaws. I'd like to take a brief moment to step out of the suffocating Ozark heat to say hello and welcome you to the channel. If you have a dark fascination with forgotten history and the terrifying mysteries that small towns try to bury in the past, I would be absolutely honored to have you subscribe. We uncover these chilling, lost stories together, and your support truly keeps this channel alive. Now, let's return to Blackwood Ridge, where the heat was about to break, revealing something far worse than a summer drought. The true, paralyzing dread that gripped the surrounding community did not stem purely from the sisters' unsettling appearances, but from the impossible, paradoxical state of their farm. While every other family on the ridge was slaughtering their starving livestock and watching their crops turn to ash, the Caldwell sisters possessed the largest, most aggressive, and heavily overfed hogs in the entire county. The massive swine paced violently in their reinforced wooden pens, their eyes wild and red, their massive bodies thick with unnatural muscle. It defied all rural logic. There was no grain to feed them, and the communal wells had run dry weeks ago. Yet, the soil immediately surrounding the Caldwell property was strangely damp. It did not weep clean groundwater, but rather a thick, foul-smelling, black alkaline sludge that coated the hooves of the livestock and killed whatever sparse weeds dared to grow through the crust of the earth. But the absolute epicenter of the town's localized paranoia was the barn. It sat at the very edge of the Caldwell property line, right where the cleared dirt gave way to the steep, treacherous drop-off of the deep woods. It was a massive, windowless monolith constructed of heavily weathered, gray timber. And every single evening, exactly as the bruised, red sun began to dip below the tree line and cast long, skeletal shadows across the dust, the sisters enacted a deeply bizarre, meticulous ritual. Cora and Ada would march from the farmhouse to the massive double doors of the barn. With chilling, synchronized precision, they would hold the heavy timber doors shut, and Ada would pull a massive chain through the iron handles. Then, one by one, Cora would engage 6 incredibly heavy, forged iron railway padlocks, the kind utilized by the St. Louis freight lines to secure bank shipments. The sharp, heavy, metallic clack of the steel tumblers echoing across the silent ridge felt terrifyingly final. They were not locking something out to protect their livestock. The sheer, reinforced strength of the iron suggested they were desperately locking something in. And then, deep in the dead of the suffocating, windless nights, the sounds would begin. The terrified families living miles away on the lower switchbacks of the ridge would lie awake in their stifling, sweat-soaked beds, staring at the ceiling as a low, rhythmic vibration traveled directly through the bedrock of the mountain. It was a structural thrumming, a deep, resonant, almost human chanting that vibrated up through the limestone and rattled the glass kerosene lamps on their wooden tables. It sounded like a massive congregation trapped deep beneath the earth, humming a discordant, agonizing hymn in the pitch black. The dark whispers and deeply ingrained superstitions of Blackwood Ridge might have remained nothing more than terrified local folklore, had the disappearances not begun. It started quietly, predictably, with the transient population. Desperate, nameless farmhands and drifters moving through the Ozarks looking for day labor simply vanished into the blistering heat haze along the upper trails. But the town's willful ignorance finally, violently shattered in the first week of August. A young, educated, and well-connected land surveyor from Little Rock, dispatched by the state to redraw the county lines, walked up the winding trail toward the Caldwell property with a brass transit compass and a leather satchel full of maps. He was seen at noon by a local blacksmith, wiping the sweat from his brow and complaining about the bitter, coppery smell lingering in the air. He never returned down the mountain, leaving behind a terrified, paralyzed town and a mystery that was about to require the brutal intervention of the law. That brutal intervention arrived in the second week of August in the dust-caked, weary form of Constable Elias Thorne. The local authorities of Blackwood Ridge, paralyzed by generations of deeply ingrained mountain superstition and a very real, suffocating fear of the Caldwell sisters, had officially declared the young surveyor a tragic, unavoidable victim of the unforgiving wilderness. They claimed, without a single shred of physical evidence, that the educated city boy had simply lost his footing in the blinding heat and fallen into one of the countless, undocumented limestone crevices that honeycombed the unforgiving county. But the surveyor's family back in the affluent, civilized parlors of Little Rock was deeply unsatisfied with the cowardly incompetence of the local sheriff. They utilized their considerable political and financial leverage to hire outside, objective law enforcement. Constable Thorne was a pragmatic, fiercely logical man from a neighboring jurisdiction, a hardened veteran of the bloody border skirmishes who possessed absolutely no patience for backwoods folklore, religious fanaticism, or small-town silence. He was a man grounded entirely in the physical world of footprints, documented motives, and cold, undeniable evidence. He rode into the blistering, sun-bleached valley of Blackwood Ridge wearing a heavy, sweat-stained canvas duster, carrying a meticulously maintained Winchester repeating rifle in his saddle scabbard, completely determined to drag the truth out of the dying mountain. The ride up the jagged, sun-baked switchbacks to the Caldwell property was an exercise in pure physical endurance. The air was so thick with stagnant humidity and pulverized yellow dust that it coated the back of Thorne's throat like wet ash, making every breath a labored, painful effort. The deafening, maddening shriek of the summer cicadas seemed to amplify the higher he climbed, a relentless acoustic assault that battered his senses. But as his exhausted, heavily lathered horse finally breached the tree line and stepped onto the Caldwell's cleared property, the screaming of the insects abruptly ceased. The silence that blanketed the farm was absolute, heavy, and deeply unnatural. Thorne dismounted, his boots crunching loudly on the baked, cracked earth, his hand resting instinctively on the polished wooden grip of his heavy Colt revolver. Cora and Ada Caldwell were already waiting for him on the deeply shadowed, sagging front porch of their farmhouse, entirely unbothered by the suffocating 90-degree heat. Cora sat rigidly in a high-backed wooden rocking chair, a heavy iron-clasp family Bible resting squarely on her lap. Her pale, washed-out eyes tracked Thorne's every movement with the cold, unblinking calculation of a hunting hawk. When Thorne formally introduced himself and produced his official writ of investigation regarding the missing surveyor, Cora did not flinch, nor did she offer even a rudimentary facade of rural hospitality. She merely tightened her skeletal grip on the Bible, her voice a sharp, biting rasp that cut through the dead air. She quoted the book of Revelation, speaking of plagues, droughts, and the righteous consumption of the wicked, firmly stating that the Lord, not the law, swallowed up men who trespassed where they did not belong. But it was Ada, standing silently just behind her sister's chair like a massive, coiled guard dog, who truly unsettled the seasoned constable. The mute woman gripped the scarred wooden handle of a heavy iron pitchfork, her broad shoulders tense, her jaw set in a permanent, aggressive underbite. As Thorne stepped closer to the porch, demanding to inspect the perimeter of the property, Ada's left hand shifted on the pitchfork. The blinding midday sun caught the grotesque, deeply scarred tissue of her missing fingers. Thorne's eyes locked onto the injury. The stubs were not the clean, straight surgical cuts typical of a tragic farming accident involving a mechanical thresher or a wood saw. The flesh was violently, jaggedly torn and pocket, bearing the distinct, undeniable, and horrific semicircular impression of a massive, crushing bite radius. Something with immense, terrifying jaw strength had completely severed the digits, and Thorne knew instantly it was not a domestic dog or a wild mountain wolf. Refused entry to the house but armed with his legal writ, Thorne turned his back on the imposing sisters and walked the arid property line. He observed the unnatural, terrifyingly aggressive hogs pacing violently in their reinforced wooden pens, their massive bodies thick with dark, heavy muscle despite the total lack of grain. But his investigation inevitably led him to the massive, windowless gray barn standing at the precipice of the ridge. Standing before the massive timber doors, Thorne saw the 6 heavy, forged iron St. Louis Railway padlocks sealing the structure shut. He reached out to touch the rusted metal, but stopped abruptly as his boots sank into the earth. The soil immediately surrounding the foundation of the barn was not the dry, cracked white clay of the drought-stricken ridge. It was saturated. It was weeping a thick, gelatinous, foul-smelling black alkaline sludge that bubbled sluggishly from beneath the heavy timber walls. It smelled of ancient, stagnant dampness, rotting organic matter, and the heavy, metallic tang of raw copper. It was a geographical impossibility in the middle of a catastrophic summer drought, and it practically screamed of a deeply buried, terrifying secret. Thorne was not the only man in Blackwood Ridge to notice this impossible anomaly. Down in the valley, Dr. Silas Mercer, the desperately overworked local town physician, had been watching his community slowly die of dehydration and dysentery for weeks. Mercer was a man of modern science, logic, and profound desperation. He did not believe the Caldwells were witches, nor did he believe they were hiding murdered men in their barn. Mercer believed in geology. He theorized, with the frantic, obsessive logic of a desperate man, that the Caldwell sisters had secretly discovered and monopolized a massive, undocumented underground limestone aquifer or a deep subterranean spring directly beneath their barn. He believed the black sludge was alkaline water being pushed to the surface by immense underground pressure, and that the heavy iron locks were simply that incredibly greedy, selfish way of hoarding the only remaining water source in the county to keep their prized livestock unnaturally fat while human babies withered in their cribs. Driven entirely by his sworn medical oath and a blinding, reckless need to save his dying town, Dr. Mercer made a fatal, solitary decision. That very night, under the cover of a suffocating, pitch-black, and moonless sky, the physician abandoned his common sense and sneaked up the treacherous mountain trail alone. The heat had not broken with the sunset. It hung in the dark woods like a heavy, suffocating woolen blanket. As Mercer silently breached the Caldwell property line, gripping his heavy, black leather medical bag tightly in his sweating hand, he felt the terrifying phenomenon the locals had whispered about. A low, rhythmic, practically structural vibration began to travel directly up through the soles of his leather boots. It was a deep, resonant, and horrifyingly organic chanting that vibrated up through the solid limestone, echoing from the very bowels of the earth. Mercer ignored his screaming survival instincts, creeping across the dark, silent farmyard toward the massive silhouette of the locked barn. The next morning, as the bruised, red sun rose to bake the dust-choked valley once again, Constable Thorne sat in the town's empty, silent saloon drinking bitter coffee. He was violently interrupted by a terrified local farmer who burst through the swinging doors, his face drained entirely of color. Up on the ridge, sitting perfectly upright and half-sunk in the foul-smelling, black alkaline mud just inches from the heavily sealed barn doors, was Dr. Mercer's pristine, gold-embossed black leather medical bag. The 6 iron railway padlocks were still perfectly, securely fastened, remaining entirely untouched. But the physician, the man of logic and science who had sought to save Blackwood Ridge from the drought, was completely and entirely gone. The discovery of Dr. Silas Mercer's abandoned, gold-embossed medical bag in the foul, bubbling black mud of the Caldwell farm was the absolute, undeniable breaking point for Constable Elias Thorne. The lingering, desperate illusions of the town, that the surveyor had simply wandered off, that the transient farmhands had merely moved on to better pastures, that the doctor had been called away on a sudden, undocumented medical emergency, were violently shattered in the blistering midday sun. Thorne marched directly into the cramped, sweltering office of the local Blackwood Ridge sheriff, slamming the mud-caked leather bag onto the wooden desk with a force that rattled the tin coffee cups. But the local lawman merely stared at the bag with wide, terrified eyes, aggressively refusing to organize a search party, muttering frantic, nonsensical warnings about the Caldwell sisters' biblical curses and the things that supposedly lived in the deep limestone hollows. He was a coward, paralyzed by a lifetime of mountain folklore, and Thorne knew that if he wanted to tear the truth out of that decaying farm, he was going to have to do it entirely with his own hands. Thorne stepped out of the sheriff's office and into the suffocating, dust-choked street, his jaw set in a line of cold, furious iron. He did not ask for volunteers, he drafted them. Utilizing the absolute, unyielding authority of his state-issued badge, he systematically deputized a small, reluctant posse of 6 heavily armed, deeply terrified local townsmen. They were not hardened lawmen. They were desperate, starving farmers, blacksmiths, and exhausted shopkeepers clutching worn, lever-action hunting rifles and double-barreled shotguns with white-knuckled, trembling grips. Thorne armed himself with a heavy 10-pound iron sledgehammer requisitioned from the local livery stable, slinging it over his broad shoulder alongside his Winchester. They mounted their larvae, nervous horses in the dead, sweltering heat of the late afternoon, beginning the grueling, agonizing ascent up the treacherous switchbacks toward the ridge. The ride was an exercise in pure, mounting psychological dread. As the posse climbed higher into the dense, dying hickory forests, the bruised, swollen red sun finally began to dip heavily behind the jagged peaks of the Ozarks, casting long, skeletal, and terrifyingly distorted shadows across the baked earth. The oppressive, blinding heat of the day slowly gave way to a thick, humid, and deeply stagnant twilight. The deafening, maddening shriek of the summer cicadas reached a fever pitch, a relentless acoustic assault that seemed to actively mock the terrified men. The air grew perceptibly heavier, thick with the metallic, coppery scent of rotting organic matter and ancient, stagnant dampness that continuously wept from the Caldwell's property line. When the posse finally breached the tree line and rode into the desolate, cleared yard of the farm, the sun was perfectly bisected by the horizon, painting the sky in violent streaks of bruised purple and dying orange. And exactly as they had done every single evening for years, Coron Ada Caldwell were waiting. But they were not holding the heavy barn doors shut. They were standing shoulder to shoulder on the sagging, shadowed front porch of the farmhouse, completely illuminated by the dying red light. And they were heavily armed. Cora Caldwell held a rusted but meticulously oiled Henry repeating rifle leveled directly at Constable Thorne's chest, her pale, washed-out eyes burning with a terrifying, unblinking, and absolute fanaticism. Beside her, the massive, imposing figure of Ada clutched a heavy, double-barreled 12-gauge shotgun. The terrifying, jagged stumps of Ada's violently severed fingers rested awkwardly but firmly against the steel trigger guard. Yet, despite the 6 heavily armed men surrounding their porch with their weapons drawn and cocked, the sisters did not exhibit a single ounce of panic, desperation, or fear. They were strangely, horrifyingly calm. They stood with the rigid, absolute certainty of religious martyrs who fully expected, and perhaps even welcomed, this exact confrontation. A tense, agonizing psychological standoff ensued, stretching the already frayed nerves of the posse to their absolute breaking point. The silence in the yard was heavy, suffocating, and punctuated only by the nervous, wet snorting of the horses and the rhythmic, aggressive pacing of the unnaturally massive hogs in their reinforced pens. Thorne, keeping his Colt revolver aimed steadily at Cora's face, ordered his men to hold their fire. He was a man of the law, and he refused to initiate a massacre if he could disarm the women through sheer, authoritative force of will. He spoke slowly, clearly, and with absolute, unyielding authority, commanding the sisters to lower their weapons in the name of the state of Arkansas, outlining the overwhelming evidence connecting them to the missing surveyor and the deeply beloved town physician. Cora did not lower her rifle. Instead, a slow, deeply unsettling, and practically skeletal smile spread across her gaunt, emaciated face. It was a smile completely devoid of warmth, a terrifying contortion of cracked lips and yellowed teeth. She did not argue her innocence. She did not deny the disappearances. Instead, she began to speak in that sharp, biting, and intensely hypnotic rasp, quoting twisted, fragmented verses of scripture regarding the necessity of sacrifice to keep the earth from swallowing the wicked. She stared directly into Thorne's eyes, her voice dropping to a harsh, conspiratorial whisper that carried clearly across the silent yard. "You bring your iron and your badges, constable," she hissed, her smile widening into a grotesque mask of fanatic devotion. "But you are too late. You are already too late for the evening feed." The sheer, chilling absolute certainty in her voice made the blood run cold in the veins of the terrified posse. Before Cora could fully raise the barrel of her rifle, Thorne moved with a sudden, explosive, and terrifyingly calculated violence. He spurred his massive gelding forward, closing the distance to the porch in a fraction of a second, and swung the heavy barrel of his Winchester upward, violently striking the underside of Cora's rifle and sending it clattering loudly onto the wooden floorboards. The sudden, aggressive movement broke the trance. Ada raised her shotgun with a guttural, furious roar, but 3 of the deputized townsmen instantly leveled their weapons at her head, screaming raw, panicked commands to drop it. For a fraction of a second, the massive, mute woman looked ready to pull the trigger, her jaw locked in a permanent, aggressive underbite, but a sharp, single, commanding hiss from Cora made her freeze. Slowly, deliberately, Ada let the heavy shotgun slip from her scarred hands, the metal thudding heavily against the porch. Thorne did not waste a single breath. He vaulted from his horse, pulling heavy iron manacles from his belt, and violently secured the sisters' wrists behind their backs. Cora continued to smile that terrifying, vacant smile, whispering her fragmented scriptures into the stifling evening air as the deputies forced them down the steps and away from the farmhouse. With the sisters entirely subdued and placed under heavy armed guard, Thorne finally turned his attention to the massive, windowless gray monolith sitting at the absolute edge of the ridge. The barn loomed against the darkening sky like a massive, weathered tomb. As Thorne and 3 of his bravest, heavily perspiring men cautiously approached the colossal double doors, the environment itself seemed to violently reject their presence. The thick, gelatinous black alkaline sludge wept heavily from the soil beneath their boots, sucking at their leather soles with a sickening, wet, practically organic sound. The suffocating, metallic stench of ancient, stagnant dampness, raw copper, and profound, rotting decay was incredibly overwhelming, forcing the men to pull their kerchiefs tightly over their noses and mouths. And there, securing the massive, rough-hewn timber handles, were the 6 incredibly heavy, forged iron St. Louis Railway padlocks. Thorne handed his rifle to a deputy and gripped the heavy, coarse wooden handle of the 10-pound iron sledgehammer. The sun had completely vanished, plunging the ridge into a heavy, suffocating twilight, and the low, rhythmic, practically structural vibration that the townspeople had whispered about suddenly began to hum deep beneath the soles of their boots. It was a faint, terrifying vibration that seemed to travel directly from the center of the earth. Thorn gritted his teeth, raised the massive sledgehammer high above his head, and brought it down with devastating, explosive force against the first iron padlock. The deafening, metallic crack of steel shattering against steel violently echoed across the desolate valley, scattering the screaming cicadas into absolute silence. One by one, with agonizing, back-breaking effort, the constable systematically shattered the 6 heavy locks, the twisted, ruined iron husks dropping heavily into the bubbling black mud, leaving the massive timber doors entirely unsecured. Before we pull these heavy doors open to uncover the terrifying secret hidden in the dark, I want to pause and ask our community, which country are you watching this video from? Let me know in the comments. With a heavy, collective heave that strained the muscles of their backs and tore at the calluses on their palms, Constable Thorn and his deputized men grabbed the splintering timber edges and violently pulled the massive, unsecured double doors outward. The rusted, ancient iron hinges screamed in the stifling twilight, a high, metallic shriek that echoed off the surrounding hickory trees like a dying animal. The men instantly raised their kerosene lanterns, their lever-action rifles leveled and trembling, fully expecting the blinding amber light to illuminate a massive, blood-soaked slaughterhouse, a den of stolen livestock, or a grotesque torture chamber hidden from the judgment of the town. Instead, as the heavy wooden doors swung wide to reveal the interior of the barn, the men were met with an impossible, vertiginous void that defied all rural logic and violently stripped the breath from their lungs. The barn was completely, utterly empty. There were no wooden stalls, no iron feeding troughs, no rusted farming implements, and absolutely no livestock. But infinitely more terrifying was the realization that the massive structure did not even possess a flaw. The heavy, weathered gray timber walls were nothing more than a hollow, architectural shell built entirely to conceal a massive, naturally occurring geological nightmare. The men found themselves standing on a narrow, terrifyingly unstable wooden catwalk that ringed the interior perimeter of the barn, staring down into the gaping, pitch-black maw of a colossal limestone sinkhole. It was a perfectly vertical, abyssal shaft plunging hundreds of feet straight down into the uncharted, subterranean cave systems of the Ozark Mountains. A freezing, incredibly foul updraft rushed violently out of the darkness, hitting the sweating men like a physical blow. The air rising from the abyss was freezing cold, completely contrasting the suffocating summer heat of the ridge, and it carried the overwhelmingly concentrated, sickening stench of ancient, stagnant dampness, raw copper, and profound, rotting meat. Thorn stepped cautiously onto the narrow wooden catwalk, his heavy boots creaking precariously on the rotting planks, his lantern held out over the terrifying drop. The beam of light barely penetrated the suffocating darkness of the shaft, illuminating only the sheer, jagged limestone walls slick with the same gelatinous, foul-smelling black alkaline sludge that wept from the earth outside. The low, rhythmic, practically structural vibration the townspeople had whispered about was deafening here. It was a deep, resonant, and horrifyingly organic thrumming that vibrated up from the absolute bottom of the shaft, echoing against the stone walls like the heartbeat of something incredibly massive and buried alive. As Thorn moved his lantern along the edge of the precipice, the weak amber light caught the glint of metal and polished leather resting meticulously on the wooden planks, revealing the true, macabre purpose of the Coldwell's daily ritual. Arranged around the entire circumference of the terrifying abyss were dozens of deeply personal, tragic artifacts, laid out with a sickening, obsessive precision. They were not discarded as trash, they were organized into neat, meticulous concentric circles, forming a twisted, sprawling religious shrine to the darkness below. Thorn's stomach turned to pure ice as he recognized the high-quality, scuffed leather riding boots of the missing young surveyor from Little Rock, sitting perfectly upright at the edge of the drop. Just inches away, resting on a folded, moth-eaten handkerchief, was Dr. Silas Mercer's engraved gold pocket watch. The heavy glass face had been violently shattered, but the delicate gold hands were frozen permanently in time, surrounded by a macabre halo of rusted tintype photographs, bone buttons, straight razors, silver belt buckles, and worn pocket knives belonging to the countless, nameless transient farmhands who had vanished from the county over the decades. It was a horrifying museum of the dead, a meticulous inventory of the missing, offered up to the mouth of the earth. Moving with a sick, paralyzing dread toward the far end of the narrow catwalk, directly opposite the open barn doors, Thorne discovered a makeshift, rough-hewn wooden lectern built from splintered hickory branches. Resting heavily upon it, illuminated by the flickering, unsteady light of the deputies' lanterns, was a tall stack of weather-beaten, tightly bound leather journals. The covers were stained with a dark, rusted brown residue that Thorne immediately, instinctively recognized as old, oxidized blood. He holstered his heavy Colt revolver, his hands shaking slightly as he opened the topmost ledger. The pages were completely filled with Cora Caldwell's frantic, spidery, and practically manic handwriting, penned in dark iron gall ink that had bled heavily through the cheap paper. It was not a confession of traditional murder, nor was it a simple ledger of stolen goods. It was a terrifying, deeply blasphemous religious text, blending bastardized biblical scripture with highly detailed, clinical agricultural records. As Thorne read the frantic, jagged passages aloud to his terrified, trembling deputies, the absolute, horrifying reality of the Blackwood Rich disappearances crystallized in the freezing updraft. The Caldwell sisters did not view the massive limestone sinkhole as a geographical hazard, they worshipped it. In Cora's deeply fractured, fanatical mind, the abyss was the open, starving mouth of a subterranean angel, an ancient, divine entity bound beneath the bedrock of the Ozarks. When the catastrophic summer drought had descended upon the county, turning the crops to ash and drying the communal wells, Cora had not seen it as a shift in the weather. She had seen it as a divine punishment, a sign that the angel was starving and angry. Her journals revealed a twisted, horrific covenant. In exchange for the thick, black, mineral-rich alkaline sludge that kept their soil miraculously damp and their massive hogs unnaturally fat, the angel demanded a constant, living tithe. The sickening, paralyzing truth of the missing men washed over the posse. The sisters had not been poisoning the drifters, nor had they been shooting them in their sleep. They had been actively hunting them. Ada, with her terrifying, immense physical strength, had ambushed the transient workers, the young surveyor, and finally, the desperate Dr. Mercer, dragging him violently across the dark property. Cora's meticulous notes detailed the horrific, nightly rituals. They had marched the terrified, bound men to the edge of the narrow wooden catwalk in the pitch black, reading frantic verses of twisted scripture over the roaring wind of the abyss, before violently pushing them backward over the precipice. They had fed the men to the sinkhole entirely alive. The low, rhythmic, vibrating sounds the townspeople heard echoing through the limestone on the sweltering summer nights were not the sisters chanting. It was the terrifying, echoing acoustics of the deep earth masking the fading, agonizing screams of the men as they plummeted hundreds of feet into the absolute, crushing darkness. The deputies stood frozen on the edge of the catwalk, their faces chalk-white masks of pure, unadulterated terror, staring down into the black void that had swallowed the doctor and countless others. The sheer scale of the Caldwell's madness was incomprehensible, a localized, fanatical genocide committed in the name of a dying farm. But as Constable Thorne closed the blood-stained ledger, a new, deeply unsettling realization began to gnaw at the edges of his hardened, logical mind. The horrific story was complete, the mystery solved, yet the low, rhythmic, practically structural vibration emanating from the bottom of the sinkhole had not ceased. In fact, as the freezing updraft rushed out of the dark, carrying that overwhelmingly concentrated stench of rotting meat and ancient copper, the vibration seemed to be growing steadily louder, shifting from a dull thrum into a frantic, chaotic, and terrifyingly organic scratching sound echoing aggressively up the limestone walls. It was a sound that violently bypassed logical thought and struck directly at the primal, deeply buried center of the human nervous system. Constable Thorne stood absolutely frozen on the rotting wooden catwalk, the heavy iron gall-stained ledger of Cora Caldwell slipping from his numb fingers to drop into the pitch-black abyss below. He did not hear it hit the bottom. Instead, that chaotic, organic scratching intensified, multiplying from a single, isolated echo into a deafening, collective wave of acoustic terror. It sounded like thousands of heavy, sharpened bone needles frantically scraping against wet stone, accompanied by a wet, guttural chattering that practically vibrated the teeth in the deputies' skulls. A desperate, deeply illogical, and wildly dangerous hope seized Thorne's chest. Dr. Silas Mercer had only been missing for 12 hours. If the sinkhole possessed jagged, protruding limestone shelves near the surface, there was a microscopic, practically impossible chance that the physician had survived the fall and was desperately trying to climb his way out of the dark. Refusing to abandon a man he had sworn to protect, Thorne violently ordered his trembling men to fetch the thick, heavy coils of braided hemp rope they had lashed to their saddles. With frantic, uncoordinated movements driven by pure adrenaline, they securely tied the iron handles of 3 heavy kerosene lanterns to the ends of the ropes. With a sickening, collective dread, they slowly began to lower the amber, flickering lights down into the freezing, foul-smelling updraft of the shaft. The heavy lanterns descended 10 feet, then 30, then 50, their weak beams desperately fighting against the suffocating, absolute darkness of the subterranean cavern. The jagged, wet limestone walls slipped past in a dizzying, vertical blur, heavily coated in that thick, gelatinous black alkaline sludge. At roughly 100 feet down, the swinging lanterns finally illuminated a massive, protruding rock shelf, a wide subterranean plateau that extended deep into the uncharted cave system. And the light revealed the true, paralyzing horror of Blackwood Ridge. There was no divine, subterranean angel. There was no biblical leviathan bound in the earth. The plateau was completely, utterly covered by a massive, thriving, and deeply feral colony of biological nightmares. The light washed over hundreds of emaciated, practically skeletal figures, crouching low against the wet stone like giant, malformed spiders. Their skin was entirely devoid of pigment, a sickening, translucent, practically luminous white that revealed the dark, pulsing veins and heavy musculature beneath. They were humanoid, perhaps the deeply mutated, inbred descendants of lost miners from a century prior, or something infinitely older and native to the lightless depths of the Ozarks. But they were no longer men. As the amber light of the lanterns violently pierced the absolute darkness they had known for generations, the colony reacted with a terrifying, unified shriek. Hundreds of completely white, unblinking, and entirely blind eyes snapped upward toward the catwalk. The light revealed their jaws, distended and filled with jagged, naturally sharpened teeth, dripping with the dark, rusted blood of the missing men. The sickening truth of Ada Caldwell's missing fingers hit Thorne with the force of a physical blow. She had not lost them in a farming accident. She had reached too far into the dark during the evening feed, and the starving, ravenous colony had surged upward and violently claimed its tithe. The sudden introduction of light and the scent of fresh, sweating terror drifting down from the open barn doors sent the massive colony into an absolute, blinding frenzy. The chaotic scratching sound instantly amplified into a deafening, terrifying roar as the pale, translucent creatures launched themselves at the sheer vertical walls of the sinkhole. They began to scale the wet limestone with an impossible, terrifying, and deeply insectoid speed, their elongated, heavily calloused fingers finding invisible purchase in the jagged rock. They were violently surging upward, a massive, writhing tide of pale flesh and clicking teeth, desperately racing toward the narrow wooden catwalk where the terrified men stood. Pure, unadulterated panic completely shattered the fragile discipline of the posse. The deputies did not attempt to pull the lanterns back up. They simply dropped the heavy ropes into the abyss, stumbling backward over each other in a desperate, violent scramble to reach the massive timber doors of the barn. Thorne, driven by the absolute certainty that if that feral, subterranean colony breached the surface, the entire county of Blackwood Ridge would be slaughtered in their beds, made a desperate, split-second tactical decision. He knew that 6 iron railway locks would not hold against the sheer, crushing mass of the ascending horde. As he sprinted out of the barn and into the stifling, humid night air, he violently tackled the deputy carrying the heavy canvas satchel of mining dynamite they had requisitioned from the sheriff's office for clearing Rock Falls. Thorne frantically tore open the satchel, his hands shaking violently as he jammed thick, heavy sticks of the volatile explosive directly into the rotting, load-bearing timber beams flanking the massive barn doors, and deep into the cracked limestone foundation supporting the structure over the sinkhole. He did not measure the fuses, he simply cut them short with his hunting knife, struck a sulfur match against the sole of his boot, and touched the flame to the cord. The fuses sparked with a terrifying, aggressive hiss. Thorne screamed for his men to run, sprinting blindly across the dark, foul-smelling mud of the yard toward the farmhouse where the Caldwell sisters remained bound. The explosion was practically apocalyptic. The percussive blast hit the posse hard enough to knock the breath from their lungs and throw them violently to the cracked earth. A blinding, searing flash of white light temporarily illuminated the entire ridge, followed instantly by a deafening, localized thunderclap that shattered every glass window in the farmhouse. The massive, windowless gray barn was completely lifted off its foundation for a fraction of a second before violently, catastrophically imploding. Thousands of tons of shattered, burning timber, twisted iron, and heavy, jagged limestone collapsed directly inward, completely choking the throat of the massive sinkhole and sealing the abyss under an impenetrable mountain of burning rubble. The ground shook violently, a localized earthquake that finally, permanently silenced the terrifying, organic scratching echoing from the deep. As the heavy, choking cloud of yellow dust and black smoke rolled across the yard, Thorne slowly pushed himself off the ground, his ears ringing with a high, painful whine. He looked toward the sagging front porch. Ada Caldwell was on her knees, staring blankly at the burning wreckage of the barn, her heavy shoulders slumped in a strange, terrifying defeat. But Cora Caldwell was screaming. It was not a scream of terror or physical pain. It was a high, agonizing, and deeply fanatical wail of absolute despair. She thrashed violently against her heavy iron manacles, her pale eyes wide with horror, screaming into the suffocating night air that they had buried the angel, and that the earth would now rise up and consume them all for their profound, unforgivable blasphemy. The official state report filed by Constable Elias Thorne in the autumn of 1891 was heavily sanitized for the fragile sensibilities of the public. It stated simply that the Caldwell sisters were responsible for the murders of several transient men due to a violent, localized religious mania, and that their barn had tragically caught fire and collapsed during the subsequent armed standoff. The state governor, desperate to avoid a massive, uncontrollable panic regarding uncharted subterranean cave systems and the terrifying things that might live within them, permanently sealed the sisters' blood-stained ledgers in the state archives. Cora and Ada Caldwell were quietly and efficiently transferred to a maximum security state asylum for the criminally insane, where they spent the remainder of their natural lives locked in entirely windowless, soundproofed cells, completely cut off from the dark earth they had so fervently worshipped. But the deeply superstitious, isolated residents of Blackwood Ridge did not need official state reports to know the terrifying truth. The catastrophic summer drought eventually broke, but the town never truly recovered its spirit. Over the following decades, the population slowly hemorrhaged, families packing their meager belongings and fleeing the high ridge for the safer, civilized valleys below. Today, the area is nothing more than a dense, overgrown ghost town, completely reclaimed by the aggressive, impenetrable hickory forests of the Ozarks. Modern hikers, seasoned hunters, and local authorities all strictly, unequivocally avoid the specific coordinates of the old Caldwell property line. Because they say, on the deeply suffocating, windless summer nights, when the heat hangs in the trees like a heavy woolen blanket, if you stand perfectly still near the massive, overgrown mound of shattered timber and crushed limestone, you can still hear it. Beneath the deafening scream of the cicadas, deep beneath the heavy bedrock of the mountain, there is a faint, rhythmic, and terrifyingly desperate sound of thousands of pale hands, frantically scratching against the stone in the dark. Would you like to move on to a new video title to generate the next dark historical mystery outline?